Hello everyone, welcome back to yet another exciting and insightful session, a one-on-one conversation with best-selling author of The Gray Rhino, Michele Wucker, and the session will be moderated by one of the leading CHROs from the region, Nadia Tan Abdullah, CHRO SP Setia Barhat, on the topic Act Quickly and Adapt Smartly for Navigating the Unexpected Challenges. With digital, climatic, geopolitical, and other disruptions happening on ongoing basis, it is clear that organizations need to continue doing a close tussle with the evident threats which might affect their businesses. In her book, Michele has emphasized the need for businesses to address the highly probable, high impact, yet neglected threats. Let's explore in this session how can we identify the threats and what can we do about them. Before we begin, let me give you a brief introduction of our speakers today. Michele coined the term Gray Rhino as a call to take a fresh look at how we respond to obvious, probable, and impactful risks. She is a media think tank executive. Her 4 books include the influential global bestseller, The Gray Rhino, which most of you must have already read, and the recently released sequel, You Are What You Risk, The New Art and Science of Navigating an Uncertain World. Nadia comes with more than 2 decades of HR expertise with focus on organizational development and change management. Her experiences span across both local and Fortune 500 multinationals in various industries. This has given her both breadth and depth of understanding for the business and ability to connect business results through creative people strategies. Her passion has always been in the work around women and leadership, and has played lead roles within diversity advocate initiatives. She is also an elected council member for Malaysian Employers Federation since 2018. Thank you so much, Nadia and Michele, for joining us. It is such a big pleasure to host you both. I'm sure our audience would be very excited to hear you both, and it's such a privilege, Michele, to have you and hear Gray Rhino's principles and first-hand experience. Thank you so much. So without any further ado, let me pass the frame to both of you. Over to you, Nadia.
Thank you, Sashi. I think we're really very privileged and honored today to have Michele. I mean, obviously, she's a writer to be a very well respected writer, and what better time to hear from her thoughts from the book, because I'm sure you have read Gray Rhino or you've heard of it, but it is no better time to talk about it as it is now when we are going through the pandemic. So Michele, I'd just like to, as Sashi has mentioned earlier on, you've written the book, you've had lots of experiences, and I mean, your thoughts have been really, I would say, provoking in many, many ways. I've done some research and some reading on what you've written, but what I really think is to get a little bit more to hear from you directly, as in, what are your thoughts about what's happening in the last 2 years? I mean, obviously, the last 2 years have been quite an exciting time, I would say, to use it more positively rather than having to say this gloomy days of, a quarantine and viruses and everything else. I think it has been quite exciting for many of us in the sense that in every corner of the world, everyone's scrambling, but also learning and getting new insights and as to what this whole pandemic, which is all unprecedented, has presented to us. I just want to hear from your thoughts in relation to what you wrote on the Gray Rhino principles or events. Let's hear from you.
Yeah, well, it's been a very interesting time, as you say, euphemistically. At the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of people were coming out and saying, "Oh, Black Swan, nobody could have seen it coming." And I said, wait a minute, Bill Gates had this TED Talk in 2015 that said we're not prepared. So many think tanks, public health officials, public health organizations have come out and said this is a huge risk for us. In January of that year, the World Economic Forum Top Risks Report had included the possibility of a pandemic. And of course, we didn't know exactly what it would look like. We didn't know exactly when it was going to hit, but it was a very obvious thing. It was very obvious that it was a matter of when, not if, and that we weren't as prepared as we needed to be. And this is really the kind of question that provoked the gray rhino and why I created the metaphor. It was a way to talk about this question of why some people see the big obvious thing coming at them and do something about it, and others don't. So the rhino, obviously, big, obvious, dangerous, coming at you, is dynamic. And gray is a metaphor for the fact that when you look at a rhino, if you're looking just at the rhino, you say, well, it's gray. What color is it? It's gray, right? But we have these 2 rhino species out of the 5 that are remaining on the planet, that the black rhino is gray and the white rhino is gray. And to me, it was a way to express just how much we take for granted that if something's obvious, then we're paying attention and dealing with it, that we're not. And it's interesting, when we first shopped around the book in the US, a lot of editors said, well, of course we pay attention to obvious things. So why do you need a book about we need to pay more attention to obvious things? Because that's not counterintuitive. And I went, oh, it's so counterintuitive, they don't even know about it. And so I emphasize this neglected part, but it meaning more that we neglect obvious things in general. We tune them out, and but some people don't. And I'm really focused on the ones who do. And some of the Western media has misinterpreted this as the gray rhino is by definition neglected, that particular event that nobody does anything about it, which is not my point at all. We have the elephant in the room for that, which normalizes doing nothing. Mm-hmm. And my point is you're more vulnerable to doing nothing than you think. And let's learn about why some people see the gray rhino coming and do something and others don't. So when the pandemic started raging around the planet, we saw very different reactions from different governments, from different people. In the United States, it's like they're 2 different countries when it comes to the pandemic. Some people who put the masks on, who get their vaccinations, and there's other people who run around bragging about not having a mask or vaccination. And so it's a really good way of framing, why do some people see this coming and do something and others don't? And I've been asked a lot, as you can imagine, was the pandemic a black swan or gray rhino? And first of all, I get nervous when people talk about it in the past, because the gray rhino is meant to be something in the future. You're looking ahead, and you can only see black swans in the past. But it is useful to look at past gray rhinos to learn from them, from what we can do better, and to remind ourselves that we're not necessarily dealing with something just because it's obvious. And the pandemic has drawn attention to existing gray rhinos that became worse, to inequality, to climate change, to financial fragilities. So the pandemic started out as a gray rhino, continues to be, and has created new gray rhinos into the future.
So Michele, that's interesting when you talked about how, different governments were responding differently. And obviously around the world, we have different cultures, different value system. I was just, as I was listening to you, you mentioned, and you mentioned, Microsoft, right? Bill Gates. I happened to work in Microsoft 15 years ago. And I know Microsoft is super structured, planful organization, very sort of intuitive, and used a lot of data. And everyone else talk about data nowadays, and data analytics. So if you have the data, you analyze, you'll be able to kind of predict. And I work in before a data company where you talked about predictive analysis. But when you talk about Gray Rhino, do you think that when one is more prepared, as you mentioned just now, some do it differently, some just ignore or just took it for granted, has that got to do with the value system? Has that got to do with a more efficient system? What do you think is the differentiating factors if you can just share your thoughts on this.
There are so many, and it's such a great question. It's the question, right? With a capital T. And people put so much attention on prediction. And after the great financial crisis, 2008, 2009, all of these boards and executives started coming up with lists of risks and assessing what's the probability and what's the impact and making lots and lots of lists. And they spent so much time working on the lists and the predictions that they didn't spend enough time on their responses. And for me, there's a feedback loop. You predict something. If you deal with either keeping it from happening or making yourself more resilient, well, your predictions has to change because the conditions are changing. And so there are two sets of reasons why some people or organizations are better at dealing with gray rhinos or the other. And it's actually talked about in the Gray Rhino in one way, and the mirror image is in the new book, You Are What You Risk. So the Gray Rhino is about the events themselves and the stages of our reactions, whether you're denying it, whether you recognize it's there, but you're coming up with reasons not to deal with it, whether there's a good diagnosis of what you're going to do, whether the people who have the power to do something are willing to do something about it, and how you can change those dynamics. The panic stage, and this is where you may or may not have a plan, but everyone's running around and screaming, do something, do something, anything, just do something. And sometimes you do something, but it's often the wrong thing. And then there's finally action, which doesn't just stop with the action, but includes tracking. How well is this affecting things? So that's the Gray Rhino. That's the structure of the Gray Rhino event. And then in the sequel, I flipped it because so many people asked me about applying the Gray Rhino in their personal lives. And then I started looking at all of these CEOs making terrible personal risk decisions, throwing tantrums if they didn't have the right kind of tequila and bragging about sleeping with Russian spies and, this crazy stuff. And I realized that there's so much about the individual and the organization itself that affects our response. So that's what what you risk is about. It's about how different cultures support different responses, how your own innate personality or your company culture, the environment, the habits, and the processes that you create, all of these come together to affect whether you deal with the gray rhinos or not. And in both cases, it really comes down to self-analysis and added attention to responses, not just the predictions.
Yeah, and I think you nailed it when you said you talked about self-analysis and self-reflection, if I can use, you did say that, but self-reflection, because I think in most organizations, and I remember when I was in Microsoft, for every event or every project that we do, we will always have a debrief session. So what went wrong and so on. So, and you talked about how we have to learn from the past. So on that point, do you think that leadership plays a key role in ensuring that, as much as possible, we can manage the situation of the gray rhino, or do you think that we have to pivot leadership completely to a different angle post-pandemic?
Well, I think leadership is so important, but leadership means something very different to different people. For some people, it's a top-down, I'm the leader, I decide, you go do what I say, which is an obsolete way of looking at it. And you look at organizations, and in so many of them, if you go and you talk with the frontline workers, with the middle managers, and you say, what's the gray rhino facing this organization? What's the big thing that keeps you up at night? What could go wrong, and what is going wrong? And they will all tell you. But how many times does that insight go all the way to the top, where the leadership listens and does something about it? And so that's such an important component of leadership, is the looking in the right places for feedback, getting the feedback, and then with your employees, empowering them to say something and do something. One of the reasons that we may not deal with something obvious is we feel that we don't have any power to do something about it. It's with climate change, for example, there's a real misconception that any one person's actions can't change the situation. And it takes a lot of one people doing things, but people do have power. So in an organization, if someone feels that if they raise a red flag and they'll just get punished for it, they're not going to raise the warning, and that warning could save the entire company from something terrible going on. So leadership has to include that ability to listen. And it also does have to include the self-awareness of what's the risk culture that you are encouraging in your organization, and how does your own behavior affect the risks that the corporation is going to take? How does your own risk fingerprint, the influences on why you are making those risk decisions, how does that steer the company? And if you're not aware of that, you're flying blind.
Yeah, and when you talked about risk management, this has to do with what's the risk appetite of the organization, because obviously when you talked about how an organization manages the risk, you know, some are very structured, you know, you have a total framework, some are much more entrepreneurial, and therefore, you know, the risk appetite is higher. Do you see a correlationship between a high risk appetite with the success rate of managing something that you can't plan?
Well, I think it's hard to say, because when we think of risk appetite, it assumes a certain objective level of risk assigned to a certain thing, but it doesn't take into account that there are many risks that we weight differently, and that goes straight to the kind of culture of a company. You know, for a company where it's a big bureaucracy, it's been there forever, and people have always done things this way, and so they see the risk as not doing things the way that they've always done it, or of upsetting this bureaucratic hierarchy. They're going to define the risk very differently from a young organization that sees the risk as not seizing an opportunity. And there's a question I often ask clients, and it's very telling. It's, how do you define risk? And it's very different in different groups of people and organizations, but some people associate it more with danger, with peril, with loss, and some people with opportunity, you know, or particularly, you know, traders or day traders. They're like, we've got to take on risk so that we make more profit, but they don't realize that, you know, there are both sides to it. So I think it's important to have a level-headed idea about what risk is, that there are both positive and negative sides, and you need to make sure that you're assessing both properly to make the decisions. And then there's a question about your biases towards the risks that you're facing. One of the people I interviewed for You Are What You Risk is a 40-something-year-old friend of mine who had recently become CEO of his family conglomerate. And the different generations had very different definitions of their aspirations and their risks. The older generations who'd lived through civil wars and nationalizations had this memory of losing things, so they wanted to preserve capital. And the younger generation was afraid that the company was going to become obsolete going into the future and just kind of slowly decline. And so they had both ideas, very different visions and fears of how the company might decline and where the company might go. And so I asked my friend, I said, did you have a conversation about why you chose the priorities and the risks that you did? And it was like a big light bulb went on. And he came back to me later and said that they'd had a strategic planning meeting and they'd had that conversation. It was very, very useful to bringing people together, to getting some unity of purpose. And it made it much easier to gain consensus or something close to it in the direction of the company. So being aware that different risks have different priorities depending on personal and organizational culture is so important.
And I like how you talked about conversations, right? Having conversations and connections. Because I mean, when you spoke about the two generations, it just reminded me of a recent incident with my two boys. I mean, my second boy had an accident recently, and he didn't call me. He called grandpa first, because obviously he was scared he's going to get a whole ballistic missiles from me. And of course, his brother, who's studying in the UK, called him and said, "I can't believe you didn't call mom," and also said, "I can't believe you actually drove the car." Mom said, "Don't drive the car," blah blah blah, and so on. And so I have two different individuals, and my second one, Daniel, is saying, like, yeah, but I was thinking, it's cheaper for me and my friends to go in this car because he did all the maths, right? And he's optimistic guy. And then the elder brother, who's much more, calculated, disciplined, say, yeah, but what if the Audi gets into an accident? It'll be more expensive. And that conversation they're having is they're not having the same kind of conversation that you said. And it just, for me as a HR leader, it's an epiphany, because I think most often in organizations, you have leaders who have very good intentions, talented, smart, but they're all speaking from a different lens because we all grew up and have different exposures and so on. But this conversation, that connection, that asking the right questions is the one that brings about that robust thinking. Now that brings, I'm just aware of time, that brings us to the last question that I have. A lot of people talk about, and I think you spoke about it as well in your book, about risk fingerprints, about inculcating new habits and how this would be basically directing where you are in the future. Now, do you want to tell us a little bit more about how risk fingerprints would have a huge impact on whether an organization will be moving forward or moving backward, because it obviously include individuals and not just leadership level. So I think that's an interesting question that we want to debate on, because there's huge differences in whether it's a top-down approach or is it a flat, all across. Because I think nowadays our organizations are saying we need to be lean and mean. We need to be much more efficient in our communication across the board. But everyone's scrambling on which is really the best solution. I guess I don't think there's a best solution, but yeah, So risk fingerprints, yeah.
Yes. Well, so if you think of your actual fingerprint, there are three parts to it. So there's the genetic things, the arches and the loops and the whorls, the things you can't change. And that's why it's such a good biometric identifier, or a crime scene identifier. You fingerprints on the wine glass, so who done it? And so those are the things you can't change about your risk fingerprint. But then there are your experiences, your upbringing. You cut your finger with a knife or you burnt it, there's an indelible mark that's going to shape your reactions in the future. Next time you see a flame, you're like, you're going to be much more cautious. Or some people might think, oh, well, I cut myself and I survived, so I'm, more comfortable around knives. That comes from the interaction between the experience and the genetic part. And the third part is the things that you actually can control. And that involves, just like, it's hot out, your fingerprint gets sweaty. Or if you spend too much time in the bathtub, it gets all wrinkly. Or if you do a lot of manual labor, you get calluses, or you are very.
Oh, you haven't done any work, so you got really stained.
And you have this beautiful soft shea butter lotion, and it smells pretty. So that's different. Those are things you can change. So your risk fingerprint is very similar, and just like a real fingerprint, the risk decisions that you make, the risks that you take or pass on, they tell the world who you are, just like a real fingerprint does. So the innate part is your personality. It's what you're born with. There's a great tool I use called the Risk Type Compass, developed out of the UK, that helps to explain how anxious or calm you are, how impulsive or methodical. And it's very interesting that certain careers get concentrations of certain types. And so you can't change that. The second part is your upbringing and your experiences, which, something might happen, a big shock. You look at refugees coming from war-torn places, that changes the way they prioritize and calculate risks, how much experience you have in a particular area. The more experienced you are as a leader, the more comfortable you are with certain things. And then the third part, the environment. The people you surround yourself with, whether there's a good diversity of risk attitudes, spheres of knowledge that you need to make good decisions. With teenagers, you see this, your peer pressure, if your kids are going to go and drive drunk or not. But then there's also the environment, the temperature. Cold temperature makes you more likely to seek risks. If you have spicy food for lunch, whether you like it or not, whether you chose it or not, for the next few hours, you are going to be friendlier to risk taking.
And hyper and warmer.
Yes, exactly. And if you're listening to up tempo music, you're also going to be doing riskier behavior, and you have processes that you can do, take a deep breath before you make a decision. And the awareness, how aware you are of your risk fingerprint is actually a part of the risk fingerprint itself. And when you put all these things together, it's a great tool for self-awareness, for making better decisions, for improving leadership, and also for teamwork, for looking at the risk fingerprints of your team members and see how those complement each other. If there are holes, you need to bring in someone who's a little more methodical, the grown-up in the room, or if you need to bring in someone who's a little more adventurous, adventure, the entrepreneur type. And when you look at things through this lens, each one of us makes, give or take, 35,000 choices a day. Every choice is a risk. Every risk is a choice. But how often do we really look at what we're bringing to the risks that we take in life and in business and in the world?
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting because I guess organizations are traditionally known to be told that if you are planful and if you are planning things well, things should be in place. But I think that the many incidences have proven that sometimes you just can't plan anything else. Last line I would say, Michele, if you were to face leaders in organizations, what would be your wisdom that you would share with the leaders as a one line or one last advice, to face the future?
Well, it's take a fresh look at the world around you. Ask yourself, what's my gray rhino? What's the big obvious thing coming at me? How am I dealing with it? Why? And how can I use those insights to do better?
Good. So I really, really thank Michele. I think it was really insightful to hear from you. So if I were to summarize it, basically what you're saying is that number one, I think leaders plays an important role in making sure that we, manage the situation of Gray Rhino. Number two, I think the whole idea of culture, environment, and a values system, even whatever we've gone through, has a huge impact on what we will be facing in terms of how much appetite or the kind of risk fingerprints that we would have. And lastly, what you're saying is that we should be open, we should be completely aware of what's happening, and at least try to understand it rather than just taking things for granted. So thank you so much, Michele, for this time that you've taken to share with us. I'm sure we've all learned so much within the short period of time. And we look forward to hear more great things and probably, a new book that you're working on. I just also want to say all the best with your writings and probably we hear more from you in future events. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been so nice talking with you.
Wow, now that was an inspiring discussion. I'm sure our audience have a lot to take away from these insights and prepare themselves for any Gray Rhino event. Thank you so much, Michele and Nadia, for such an amazing session. A big thank you to our audience for joining us and being so participative. Do keep sharing your insights on social media using the hashtag #ETPhoenixAPAC. I'll repeat, this is #ETPhoenixAPAC, and get a chance to win Amazon vouchers. Coming up next is a case study presentation on embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion in the organization culture for business success by Janet Sellers, Director HR Officer, NASA. Now, who doesn't want to attend that? So see you all there. Thank you.